welcome to my talk at Scale Summit 2020. So I'm going to be talking today about scaling your impact at work. So my name is Nigel Kersten, I'm Field CTO at Puppet, and I spend a lot of time working with big organizations and small organizations, making large and small changes. And lots of the things I'm involved with, from large-scale transformation efforts to much smaller improvements, more tactical kind of work, end up struggling because, well, I think a lot of people in tech are either not very good at working across organizational boundaries or don't even realize that that's an option. And something I've noticed over and over again is that the people who are good at this sort of work, of working with people in teams, not just right next to them, but all the way across the other side of the organization, end up being happier at work, they end up being less frustrated, and it seems pretty good for their careers. So that's what this talk is going to be about. How do you scale out the impact that you yourself have at work? This is not going to be a talk on sort of personal development skills, like how to get better at communication, how to get better at written communication, how to summarize things, how to be better in meetings or public presentation skills. These are all really useful skills, and I'm not diminishing them at all. But you can get an awful lot done without being comfortable working in that sort of outbound way. This is going to be a talk why it's really useful for the technical work that you're trying to get done to be able to work across organizational boundaries and working upwards with your management chain. Pretty much everything I talk about here in terms of working with other teams holds just as true for working with your management chain and your manager's manager. So this talk's going to be kind of squishy. It's going to be about things that are a little less concrete than many of the other talks going on at Scale Summit. There's going to be a lot of general points and advice that this talk's going to be about. But that's because we work in environments that are full of people, and people are involved in just about everything we do at work. We tend to be social, we're social animals, and we're not ever just doing technical work on its own. So there's a couple of different angles I want to come at this. One would be, as someone who gets pulled in to be part of so-called digital transformation journeys, they mostly don't work. If you look at the amount of time, the amount of effort, the amount of people sort of being invested in these sort of, particularly in large organizations, we're going to transform the entire organization, it generally doesn't work. And I'm generally a believer in the sort of goals of something like a digital transformation effort, the idea of being more customer focused, simplifying pipelines, taking advantage of new technological capabilities. But most big organizations aren't very good at changing, because I think it's actually pretty difficult. And if they were good at changing, given the amount of effort we've spent on this as an industry, as like a species, we'd see way more transformed organizations than we actually do. On the other hand, I see too that folks in IT, and I mean this with a really broad umbrella here, everyone who works in sort of a technical role inside an organization, I'm not just talking about desktop IT, we often feel really stymied by things that they think are outside of their control, things that they can't actually change. You're trying to get something done, and there's some process or some policy that you have to follow, and you don't feel like you have any control over that. And sometimes you feel like it's not actually useful in terms of achieving something concrete for the business. Change management, audit, compliance, processes, policies. There's all these sorts of things that we have to follow, but sometimes it just feels like they get in the way. And worse, sometimes it feels like they actively make no sense at all. And particularly you see this with change management and compliance, packaging up context to people who don't actively understand the issue. You're trying to get something done, and instead of just doing it and feeling confident and autonomous in the work that you're doing, you find yourself having to write out in prose exactly what it is you're doing, how it's going to work, your plan for rollback, why you're so confident in it, and all that gets packaged up, sent off to a change control board, and it feels sometimes like a bunch of people who have no context or awareness about your job are making decisions that directly impact the sort of work you get to do. I don't think this is entirely fair. I think there's definitely cases where this is, a somewhat accurate description. But I think unfortunately in tech, we often fall into a pattern of a really us versus them mentality, with technical versus non-technical people, assuming that, we know what's right and they're just wrong, or they're outdated. They're not aware of everything that's possible right now. As a little bit of a side note, like I'm using technical a lot through this presentation, but in general, I think a lot of the way we talk about being a technical person or a non-technical person inside the tech industry is not particularly productive and just serves to sort of other people who otherwise would be able to make really useful contributions. And it sets up some sort of a, caste system. This isn't always the case, but I'd say in general, it's possible to change these things, these policies and processes that get in the way of what you're trying to actually do. And I'm going to try and give you some tips on how you can actually get those things done. So this is pretty common wisdom. Like, I don't expect this to be, some great revelation from the sky. Any big project inside a really large organization requires top-down and bottom-up effort. This is pretty much accepted by most people these days. You can't just lead things from the top, and people from the ground have to be engaged, they have to believe in the project and be motivated to work on it. But I think this actually misses one of the most critical factors for success that I've seen an awful lot. And that is, it's not just about working up and working down, it's about working horizontally in many ways, and saying that any structural change requires working across org boundaries, changes to these processes and policies that are in your way. I think this is true of people at all levels. Large-scale projects need to be able to work across org boundaries, but I actually think the interesting thing that I'm going to talk about a bit today is what it takes at the individual level. There's a reason that cross-functional teams get proposed to sort of solve big problems that cross boundaries. They're a way of solving problems that work. And we'll see how some of those attributes of a cross-functional team are things you can take advantage of, even when you're just working solo and reaching across to other people. We've seen from our State of DevOps Report research over quite a number of years now that the organizations that are more successful in whatever it is they're trying to do with modernizing DevOps practices, their IT environments, building self-service, developing platform teams, the ones that are good at this sort of work and provide enduring value across the business are the ones where people are enabled to go and work across org boundaries, where you're actually encouraged to do that sort of work. And we know silos are bad, but I think the inverse of that is that organizations that actively make it easy to work across those boundaries are the ones that do better. And a lot of this involves people skills, it involves negotiation, it involves understanding. Now, tech folks often talk, like we often talk, and I've fallen guilty of this, about this sort of work as being politics. And I think this is just wrong. We're all social animals, and the modern workplace in many ways is, gets described as a socio-technical system. There's a whole field of academic theory around here about describing not just techne, the knowledge aspects of what we do, but it's the social interactions, and that you can't just optimize one at the expense of the other, and it's about optimizing the whole system. Now, sometimes there are people, and I'm sure we've all worked with them, who are good at playing politics, at serving their own aims in some sort of manipulative way, rather than actually serving the larger value that you're trying to create as part of a project. But I think it's also true that often technical people don't always recognize the value that other areas of the business provide, either with soft skills or with specialist technical knowledge of their own, that we just don't think of that way because it doesn't involve computers. And I think in particular, something that we can be fall victim to in IT is not necessarily recognizing what constitutes business value. What is the value that you're trying to provide to whoever your customer, consumer, user, whatever it is that you're trying to do as an organization. I think sometimes we can take a myopic view within tech of what it is that the organization is actually doing and the value that other people in the organization actually provide. So you've probably seen some form of this slide over the last 10 years since the DevOps movement was created, was kicked off. This is sort of one of the classic problems that the whole movement was trying to solve. It was pretty common, and it's still common in some environments, to have a world where development teams just chuck code over the wall to operations to run in production without the developers having any understanding of the role of operations. And you have operations teams dealing with production issues with no feedback loops to development or no awareness of what it is that they're trying to actually achieve. So you've got these two teams operating with black boxes without any real visibility into each other's goals. You have misaligned incentives. The developers care about making changes by implementing features. Operations teams care about preventing change in order to ensure stability. There's no one thinking about the whole system. There's no empathy for each other's roles, and there's limited trust. This should be a reasonably familiar scenario. Like any of you, I assume, who are coming along to Scale Summit are going to be the sort of people who've come across this example at some point over the last 10 years. It's pretty well-trodden ground. So a bunch of emergent principles came out of the sort of loose collection of practices that the DevOps movement's been about. And a lot of them are non-technical. People have often said, DevOps is about sharing, it's about culture, but let's catalog a few of them. All of these have been generally acknowledged as being ways to solve the sort of problem we saw on the slide before. And there should be nothing controversial here. It's about culture. It's about creating a culture of people and the way they interact with each other to achieve certain goals. It's about autonomy and trust and empathy, and having empathy in particular for people whose jobs are different to your own. It's about system thinking, about looking to the whole system, not just the little part of it that you may be tasked with right now, but the whole system, and what does it take to actually optimize that? Who has to do what in order to optimize the larger system, not just some smaller part of it? Don't look for local optimizations, look for global optimizations. It's about creating enduring feedback loops. So different parts of the system can pass information to other parts so that you can do that sort of system-wide optimization. It's about aligning incentives of the people who are involved so that they're actually working towards a common goal and recognizing their different roles, but that they all have the same goal. And then perhaps one of the most amorphous terms around of business value, of like everyone should be aligned by a value stream, do some sort of value stream mapping exercise, those sorts of activities, and be focused on those sorts of goals. As an ops person, your goal is not to keep a server up. As a developer, your goal is not to create code. Your goal is to deliver some sort of a feature or fix some sort of issue for an end user. So DevOps, clearly involves a whole bunch of other technical stuff around automation, measurement, but all of these things here are recognized generally as principles that are used to fix unnecessary silos in a system. And it's worked. This sort of approach has become pretty mainstream. So mainstream, in fact, that we've had all these other something ops movements. We've got DevSecops, we've got GitOps, we've got FinOps, and we're pretty fond of fads and fashions in tech, but these approaches have worked well enough that we see people actually having some sort of success with them, in breaking down the boundaries between development and operations, recognizing the common ground, and achieving good results with them. Now, what I'm trying to get to with all of that preamble around DevOps was that applying these same principles to teams further away from you is harder than it is between those two adjacent groups, but it has much more impact. I work with lots of large orgs who are trying to create change from inside their IT department, and I see this over and over and over again. Apply these principles to teams further away from you and you'll get more reward, but it recreates more effort. The places where people have made significant change in the ways that their jobs actually are the ones that follow these sorts of approaches and have succeeded at doing this. People who work across with change management, risk, audit, compliance, human resources, finance, sales, marketing, to try and optimize the whole system and not just the technical part. Most of the time, these efforts are led by people on the ground. It's much more common for me to see someone who gets labeled a change agent doing this sort of work from a practitioner perspective rather than necessarily a managerial or senior manager perspective. Generally, senior managers coordinating with each other don't achieve as great results as people on the ground working with each other. And I think, again, that comes back to context. It's about having all of the context around the job and what needs to be done and being able to explain that to someone else and collaborate with them. And to reiterate what I said at the beginning, what I've noticed over and over again is that it's really good for these people's careers internally. It seems to be good for their sense of well-being, their sense of happiness. They're not constantly frustrated, railing against these horrible processes that they wish didn't actually exist. They're getting stuff done, and it's a more enjoyable world. So these are some of the things I've noticed. So let's take a little diversion into why people don't actually do this more. As an ex-goth, I'm going to draw upon some analogies here from my rather misspent youth. If you are, or if you were a goth, you recognize these three singers as working in entirely different kinds of genres. But if you weren't, you'd think they look exactly the same. You've got Trent Reznor up in the top corner from Nine Inch Nails working with this angsty, angry, industrial, pop/metal vibe going on from the early days. You've got The Cure, Robert Smith with this very melancholy pop, but very, very pop aesthetic. And then Nick Cave down the bottom, gothic, alternative rock, sort of bluesy, biblical, folksy stuff. They're all pretty different, but they all probably look very much the same aesthetically to anyone who wasn't from that sort of a subculture. But what I'm trying to get at here is that these differences between these various different sort of subdivisions of goth are incredibly important to people who are within that subculture and pretty much meaningless to anyone outside. I spent a fair bit of my early 20s and late teens being very much that person up in the top left corner, claiming I was an industrial goth and denying that I was a goth in any meaningful sense. And God forbid anyone actually call me emo, which felt like a completely different planet. But the reality was, to my mother, to my grandmother, they were probably all looked exactly the same, as did, your average hardcore metal fan. And if you talk about splintering of genres and important distinctions between them, metal's like just as intense. But if you actually zoom out and have a look at all of these things, you see that the world of music genres is pretty huge, and that this itself is only one sort of small slice. And I think this is true, a lot of the stuff that we see in tech too. Like once you actually get outside of the particular domain that you're in, you'll see that the actual differences are relatively meaningless. So the point I'm trying to make here is that people who are way outside a subculture have no way of distinguishing between adjacent subcultures. You talk to anyone who's heavily into punk music, and they'll talk through all of the different kinds of punk, of rockabilly, of sludge, of crust punk, all of these sorts of things. But really, to anyone who's not deeply steeped in that world, it's all just punk music. So to bring this back to where we are here, we do this a lot in tech. We spend a lot of time creating similar distinctions within our own subculture. People get really, really passionate about their specialty. And this is great. That passion is one of the reasons we advance. We build up all this specialist knowledge inside these sort of niche areas, whether you work in cloud native or on-premise, whether you're a Linux person or a Windows person, whether that's in desktop support, whether you're a sysadmin, whether you're a network engineer, whether you do storage. Like these are meaningful differences, whether you're working on, Vim versus Emacs. Like some things are more meaningful and some things are less so. What programming language we choose. And these are meaningful sort of specializations. But I think when it comes to taking a bigger picture view and you're trying to work across the organization, it's kind of important to notice that almost no one else really cares. You're all just tech people or someone in IT. And if you really don't think this is true and you can feel the hackles rising on the back of your neck of going, no, damn it, this particular thing that I do is significantly different to everything else and most people realize that, surely you get this at holidays when you go home. Everyone will ask you to fix your printer or do desktop support, even if you have nothing to do with that sort of work. And you're probably okay at it. This was really hammered to me at home a long time ago when I was, sort of late 20s, very proud of my self-identity as a Linux admin and a Linux developer. And I was back in Australia visiting relatives on the farm and I was asked to fix a Windows problem. And I hadn't touched Windows, honestly, since NT 351 and NT 4 at that point. And so I was just like, look, I don't really know how to do Windows, and honestly felt pretty convinced in my head that I was doing the right thing. I spent ages protesting, and eventually, after a bunch of filthy looks from my mother and from my great aunt, I decided, okay, I should actually go and try and fix this machine. And I looked at it and I fixed it pretty easily. And I'm not saying that to demonstrate that I'm amazing, because fixing your average Windows problem is not like that. But that these differences don't really matter that much in the grand scheme of things. And we sort of obsess over them, and we divide ourselves up into tribes, but they're not actually that huge a difference for most people out there in the world. To bring this back to the topic, people with jobs that are entirely unlike yours really don't understand what you do. And that's not unreasonable. They have their own jobs that they're doing. But when you want to make change happen, once you want to start working across the business, you'll particularly find most people don't understand your job, and you're going to have to put effort in to help people understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. So let's go back to this somewhat artificial grouping, but I think there are a lot of organizations that are actually like this. As an industry, we've applied these non-technical principles I talked about earlier to the issues that we were facing between development and operations, and we've achieved some good things. We've caused people to have more empathy for each other's roles, we've had more cross-pollination of skills, and we've seen that, in many ways, the future of a lot of infrastructure and application building is going to require people with a much more blended set of capabilities, of an awareness of infrastructure, of understanding operational requirements, of what it means to be able to do maintenance, as well as what does it mean to be able to deal with things through an API, through programmable interfaces, to be able to merge your application and infrastructure stacks, whatever way you're actually solving these things. We've seen this work pretty well. We've even got a pretty strong common awareness of including security as well with the whole DevSecops movement. We've caused people to, shift left, apply a systems thinking approach, fix problems at the source, collaborate early, collaborate often, define your policies in the form of code, all of these sorts of things that we've done as part of DevSecops movement of taking security concerns and making them things that the developers can work with as they're writing code, not just something where you're delivering code to production and then running it through a checklist. We've got this whole new world emerging around all of this. But really, this wasn't that much of a reach. It was like a Nine Inch Nails fan talking to a Cure fan and together going and chatting to a Nick Cave fan. From the outside, you're all just tech people, and we're all just tech people. And the really impactful change, I think, is going to happen when we work out how to do this across much bigger boundaries. Here's an example. Like, you look at your average IT department. There's way more than just these groups, even within IT departments. We can often be quite snobbish. I think people, and as someone who came from desktop support, I think there's often a snobbishness around desktop support and that really sort of user-focused break and fix situation from people who work in infrastructure, from people who work in the back end, who are developers. But we're all tech people. If you look at the design teams within you, this is one of these, I think, examples where I often see the sort of use of technical and non-technical wielded as a weapon, even inside an IT organization. Network, security, storage, product management, project management. These are all different functions within IT. And I'm not going to stretch the goth analogy to breaking point here, but I am happy to take in question time, if anyone has any suggestions, what kind of a goth is a network engineer best represented as? We can talk about that then. But if we expand out even further, even bigger than the IT department, there's much bigger departments than these groups. And often to make structural changes, we have to work within these functions as well. One of the frustrations I've often found inside orgs has been when you see IT projects being kicked off and they're being held up by procurement, by finance. We haven't been allocated the funds yet, we can't go and buy something, and people will tend to, and this is one of the things I'm hoping to get people to think about here in this talk, is rather than going and trying fixing this and improving the situation, we tend to see people just sort of complain about these things as if they're laws of physics and they can't possibly be changed. But all of these departments, they're not monoliths either. Just as we're really proud of all of the specialties and different ways you can slice and dice an IT department, they're all really big and they have their own specialist roles inside them. And if we're serious about systems thinking, then we have to work across these org boundaries and include these people too when they are part of the system. We've seen over and over again that people trying to do a platform team approach where you're taking your IT capabilities and you're trying to turn it into a series of self-service products with a product mindset, where you've got a product manager going out and talking to users and building things that actually solve their problems and exposing them via self-service. Sometimes these teams end up getting stopped by the fact that things as simple as IT procurement haven't been solved and been automated. So maybe you're trying to provision an on-premise cluster, maybe you're trying to add extra storage, anything like that. And then you find that no matter how much you've optimized the rest of the system, the actual purchasing of stuff is still a several-month process inside a large organization. And that doesn't have to be the case. If we're serious about systems thinking, we can work across these org boundaries and include all of these people too. Just as, people outside of IT and outside of tech don't necessarily understand the difference between all of our own divisions of jobs, you probably don't even really understand what all of those jobs involve. And I certainly haven't until I started working more closely with them. Do you just lump all of marketing together? Or do you have an idea of the difference between product marketing, field marketing, channel marketing, PR, marketing ops? Each of these things are different specialist roles with their own skills, their own jargon, and those differences to people in a marketing department are incredibly important. You wouldn't get someone in product marketing to just jump ship into marketing operations. It requires a different kind of mindset. So what I'm kind of bringing this around to is that I think most tech people only pay lip service, and I have a mask on here so that you can't actually see the lips, to these concepts outside of tech departments. They don't think of systems thinking, and I've been guilty of this too. We don't think of systems thinking as applying to the larger system outside of the technical part of the company, of shifting left, of going and fixing problems at the source in terms of policies and procedures from outside the department, of empathy for other roles, of creating feedback loops, of actually collaborating. And it's far more common for me to see people complaining about these sort of processes being imposed on them that impact their work than to see people applying the same principles we've seen work really successfully with movements like DevOps to work across org boundaries. Even worse, I'll see technical people be somewhat belligerent and demand that change happen in those systems without demonstrating empathy, systems thinking, or taking a collaborative mindset. Some orgs are really hard to make change in, and I'm not denying that. I've worked with an awful lot of them. But I think what is worse than it being hard for an org to make change is when people just don't even try and they just simply complain. I fundamentally, and this is going to sound a little bit idealistic here, believe that most people are sensible and rational and willing to listen to your good ideas if you make an effort. But you've got to make an effort to have an understanding of what motivates them if they're the people who actually own the process. I have seen this over and over again. Change management is a great example, audit, compliance. I've seen people make major changes to how their systems and processes work inside really old, staid, boring organizations by taking the time and effort to work across boundaries in good faith and understanding what other people in the company are responsible for and how to work with them. So let's get a little more concrete with things. If you find yourself impeded by a process or policy, I think there's a couple of principles that make a really big difference here. First, remember that processes and policies can change. They're not laws of physics. It's not the gravitational constant. It's something that can actually change. It's being designed by humans, but understand why it exists. I think one of the things we quite often see is that people will make rampant changes to an organization without understanding the historical context. And sometimes that happens in the other way too, where processes in IT get removed that were actually good and helped ensure quality or helped ensure speed. But if you understand why the process exists, you're going to have a better idea of how to modernize it. Really understand why it exists and find the people who own it. Work on collaborating early in the pipeline, shift left, but learn and use their vocabulary, not yours. Understand their incentives. What is it that they're actually responsible for? What is their job? What are they on the hook for? And are you going to be making that easier or making it worse? And advocate for positive change. Compliance, I think, is a really great example here. We tend to have these external regulations imposed upon us when you work in tech of, something like separation of duties. And then someone at some point makes an analysis of what the regulations say and says, well, this is what we can actually get done, and this is how we should do it. And that process can often be fossilized and passed down through generations of people through the organization until they start thinking that that's what the regulation actually says. Separation of duties is a really similar one, where you often find that people interpret it as developers meaning not being allowed to touch production at all. But a lot of the time you go back to the regulations and they'll just say something like, whoever wrote the code cannot be the person who approves it and merges it into the code base. So we've seen an awful lot of improvement around these things, around business processes, quality processes, development, security, compliance. A lot of improvement where people have gone, this thing's in the way. We've got a new tech capability. We've built a new CI/CD system. We can test things in a certain automated way. Why do I still have to sign off things in this horrible, slow, manual sort of way? Go back, talk to the compliance people, understand in their language what it is they're on the hook for. And I've found that audit and compliance are both one of the greatest source of complaints for technical folks, but they're also some of the easiest people to talk to who aren't actually in technical roles. They tend to be really smart, really rational, and open to change, particularly if you're going to be making their jobs easier and guaranteeing that the output they're responsible for is even better. Advocate for positive change and implement feedback loops. Take these same sorts of principles that we've been used to and apply them to changing the process or policy. This works as well for working upwards with your management chain, as I mentioned earlier. If you feel like you're having things imposed upon you, I genuinely think most people are smart and rational if you understand what it is that motivates them and what they're actually responsible for. Going to end with some pitfalls, some of the things I've seen people do that definitely make this sort of work much, much harder. Don't start with a written manifesto for change. For whatever reason, I think this is a really common approach from nerds, geeks, those of us in tech. It can be really tempting to go, I know what the whole system should look like. I'm going to write a document. It's going to be 2 or 3 pages, and it's going to be such a compelling, rational argument that people will not be able to help once they've read it of going, yes, that is exactly what should happen. It almost never works. It seems to be it's taken as confrontational. It rarely displays enough empathy. If you've actually done the work and gone and built something collaborative with someone else, that's different. But a call to arms and a manifesto for this is why this whole system should be blown up and replaced like this is only really going to put people's backs up, and it's not going to be particularly collaborative. Don't approach this sort of work where you're collaborating across boundaries as an argument to be won. This is not a winners or losers zero-sum game where you're going, okay, either the change management or procurement people will change their mind or I will change my mind. There's almost always some sort of middle ground based upon information you probably don't know yet. One of the worst sort of sins I see folks in tech commit is assuming that they are modern and they have all the modern knowledge and that people outside of the technical departments are outdated and aren't keeping up with the times. Every field advances in some way or another. People have different processes. There's new ways of approaching things. Technology does not have a stranglehold on progress and on modernizing aspects of the business. Really don't assume your jargon makes sense. As I was going through before, the differences between the things we do in tech in different areas and different roles are somewhat meaningless to people who are a long, long way away from them. If you're talking about building, say, a new automation capability or a new CI/CD system, find out if you're talking to someone about risk and compliance, how to express what you've got in terms of the language they use to define the policies and processes. And finally, don't assume that one conversation will create change. I think this is something I see a lot of time with tech where they're like, I went and spoke to these people, I explained to them where they were going wrong, and then I left it, and clearly I'm going to hear back from them about why they've actually fixed things. These things require ongoing effort. These are people. Again, go back to the original principles of empathy, feedback loops, systems thinking, understanding that people with different roles have different areas of expertise, and you can generally get things fixed. And this tends to be a much better path than complaining about things. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm joined by Nigel here, who's kindly here to help answer some of the questions that we've had throughout this. And I just want to thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. And I know you talked about it being, the soft, squidgy stuff, but actually for a lot of us, as we get more senior, that becomes more important to us that we're able to deal with that soft, squidgy stuff. So thank you for really talking about it and talking about people rather than resources. That's an important thing for us to remember at all times. Your bio says that you're a Field CTO from Puppet, which I think is probably the coolest job title I've ever seen. And Bob in the chat also wanted to know, what actually is a Field CTO? Can you describe what that does and how that works?
Yeah, it's funny because I think CTO has, always been sort of a weird umbrella term where it covers a bunch of different things. There's been, the chief architect. There's the sort of external visionary evangelist. There's the, founder who has stepped aside from being CEO and is not quite sure what they want to be anymore within a company. And then there's sort of the voice of the customer. I think, I'm pretty sure CTO magazine or something has characterized things like that. Field CTO seems to have emerged a lot in the last couple of years, particularly in tech companies, where you're essentially, more of that voice of the customer, really senior technical person, work closely with sales and with professional services and sort of the implementation side of the business. So at Puppet, you can think of me like I'm essentially CTO of the customer success part of the organization, which for us is professional services, solutions architects, the people sort of not building the product, but helping people get success out of the product.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And in the talk, you talk about the sorts of problems around people being, the further out people are, the more change you can have and so forth. Is that something that's inevitable for organizations of a certain size? We heard earlier about as organizations grow, the deep hierarchy kind of feels natural to it. Is there stuff that you think we can do to keep those connections working and make it easier and not fall into that trap?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we don't have a lot of examples of really big companies that have grown up with relatively sort of modern principles around them, in terms of, flatter hierarchies and modern communication ways. And so a lot of this is sort of big hierarchical organizations that really subscribe to Taylorism and these sort of theories of manufacturing in terms of how people do work, where everyone's interchangeable cogs, and they're all in the middle of transition. And I think if you pick me, I go up and down in terms of my cynicism and optimism about the future of really, really large companies. And if you get me on a bad day, I'll be just like, no, everyone's doomed. If you're in a company of above 10,000 people, like no one will ever actually be able to achieve anything. On other days, I feel a little more optimistic about it. So I think you have these problems sometimes in smaller companies as well. And one quick note I wanted to make is that we talk sometimes about, hierarchies and flattening hierarchies. And you get to some organizations that have tried to take an approach where they're like, everyone clusters and swarms around activities as they need to happen. I pretty strongly believe that in any organization, past the Dunbar number of a couple of hundred people, if there isn't an explicit sort of hierarchy and separation of roles, it'll become like a shadow organization. And in some ways that can be more toxic and more difficult to operate in. As far as like smaller companies growing into bigger companies and how you can avoid some of these problems, there's a few things I think I've changed my mind a lot as I've started working with bigger companies. I think career ladders and like defined, this is what a junior, this is what a senior, this is what a principal and a staff engineer, all of those sorts of things. I think having really defined career ladders around responsibilities is actually really helpful for individuals, and it's not just a sign of bureaucracy. I think as a manager, and I think your sort of middle management layer here is really important as you go through scaling as an organization. Things you can do to encourage crossing org boundaries and not creating silos are relatively simple. It's like shared goals across teams, giving people the opportunity to have, internships and work on a project by project basis outside their organization, clustering with people, creating cross-functional groups. But even just explicitly putting some of these things into the career ladder. So, making it an expectation that as you get more senior as an individual contributor, your role involves working across these boundaries and promoting people on that basis. I think those sort of explicit expectations and rewards can actually be really useful for setting standards for how you want people to behave. But it also just starts with managers. If managers don't work with each other, you're going to have the same problem.
Do you think you get pushback from people who view the individual contributor role as their like isolation chamber where they can go and they can be, highly technical without having to deal with people, which is, I think some of the feedback I get from people at times is like, that's what they want, is they want to be able to just sit in a corner and hack out code and still be seen as senior.
Yeah, and I think it's a difficult balance because I think this is where it becomes really important as a manager and a team leader, to recognize you're building teams and not individuals, and you're not going to have sort of one size fits all for these sorts of roles. Some architects, like in an architect role with an engineering org, are really, really good at let me design protocols and architectures and communication protocols and all of this sort of stuff. And then others are really good at getting different teams together to collaborate on a solution together. So I don't think there's one size fits all. And I do recognize, a lot of people are in tech because they don't really love constant people interaction. But I also at the same time feel like to get anything substantial done, you can't just do it with purely technical work, which I think is a somewhat artificial distinction. We're always working with other people, unless you're like an individual contract programmer. And even then, you're probably doing an awful lot of people interaction.
Okay. WE3F asks, do you have any strategies for helping people better understand the people inside the technical part of the company? So if you're going out to other bits of the organization to talk to procurement or HR, various other people, are there, other than just, unpacking the jargon, are there strategies for actually helping them understand why they should care and get across what you do and how you do it?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few things. Not everyone always has to understand everyone else's job inside a company. And this is where I think it does get kind of squishy and a balancing act. Not everyone needs to understand everything about what you do inside your particular role in the company. But I think if you can, in the course of working with people, join the work you're doing to goals that they're aware of, don't use jargon, don't assume that your role is a higher status than theirs. I think this is something particularly in the last decade or two where we've sort of seen, the rise of the geeks inside corporations, and, developers are the new kingmakers and developers rule the world. That there's sort of been a sense of, being the blessed and the special ones and this high cabal of secret knowledge. I think, approaching with some humility and being genuinely interested in people's jobs, I think goes a long way to them then being interested in you. Something I often, this is a really old book, but I think it's really, really worth reading for a lot of people. Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People is like quite a cynical sort of title, but it's actually a really good set of guidelines for how to just sort of be nice to people and have them be nice to you, which sounds awfully squishy. And the book is written like a sales manual somewhat, but if you look through the actual advice, it's things like use people's names, show sincere interest in what they're doing, talk to them about what they're interested in, not just what you are.
Right. Yeah. No, that's really useful, and I agree. I mean, my career, I've worked in lots of different places, and I've always found it fascinating to go and find out what the organisation does, what the business does, and then ask people like, how does this bit work? And I'm sometimes shocked at the discovery that the sales team have no interest in technology at all, and really want us to get out of the way, and the realization how important that is within an organisation. So I totally agree. Finding out how people think and what they care about, how they're incentivized, really helps you understand the structure of the organization. Dave 10101 has clearly interacted with the procurement teams quite a lot, because he's got two kind of questions, one after the other. The first is, now I've spoken to procurement and found out there are a million good reasons why they have this huge arcane slow system. Who am I to offer a suggestion? How do you feel tech people should think about themselves and how they can offer suggestions to these organizations who know what they're doing and are very content with their slow, cumbersome, arcane system that just works?
Absolutely. And, I think one of the worst pitfalls of, Silicon Valley culture is being, I'm really good at computers and tech, and therefore I can apply that knowledge because I am so smart and I have a big brain to some entirely unrelated field and optimize the hell out of it. So I don't think you want to go in and go, your stuff sucks, let's fix it. What I was trying to get across with this talk, I think, is that tech folks often find themselves constrained by processes that are imposed on them by other groups. I think auditing is a really good example. So a lot of the time you'll find people in an enterprise environment having to fulfill some particular set of regulations that the organization just goes, this is some standard and we have to hit it. But in the reality, most of the time, what you're actually being asked to achieve is a particular interpretation of the standard. And it's an interpretation that's been handed down over many years of this is what it means for us at this company to be SOX compliant, PCI DSS, whatever. And yet, if you actually go and talk to the people responsible for that standard, it's more about giving them an understanding of what your teams are capable of doing, what your capabilities are in terms of tech, understanding their motivations, and trying to improve the process that affects you. I'm certainly not suggesting that it's a particularly productive career path to go floating around an organization telling everyone else how to do their job better. I'm more talking about the processes that cross those boundaries.
Yeah. And Dave kind of follows up with, once you've met these teams and you've got to meet the procurement team, you discover their giant organization, but they're heavily invested in their systems. Being the gatekeeper gives them a huge amount of power within the organization, both personal power for certain managers as well as organizational power for awareness. How do you realign that with the overall goals of the organization? Again, who are you and how do you encourage them to realign and enable the organization to do better?
Totally. And Dave, I'm sorry for whoever's hurt you from procurement and HR, because there's clearly some scar tissue there. And they've seen this before. I think one of the things that's procurement's a good example, I think. I've seen a lot of people build really dynamic, scalable systems with self-service around things as simple as, requesting infrastructure for people who are still doing things on premise, and they'll optimize all of their systems so that stuff can be done within minutes. But then ultimately there's this backing process that takes weeks through procurement. I think that's where, you go and talk to people, try and find out if it's possible. And if you are meeting that sort of resistance, there are things that it's your manager's job to sort out. So I'm not suggesting you always take everything upon yourself. And if you hit these sort of immovable walls, I think calmly representing the cost of the whole system and sort of that whole system's view of whatever it is you're trying to do, some things are for your manager to go and fight those fights. Don't take it all on yourself.
If this is as powerful as you say it is, like cross-functional thinking, being aware of the organization, then surely everybody in the organization should have to go out and discover every part of every other bit of the organization. How do we get any work done in a world like that?
Totally. And I think this is where, it's similar to writing code. You want to make your abstractions just right, like just enough, but not too much. I think don't go, an enterprise where everyone is worried about everyone else's jobs and the internal implementations, that clearly isn't scalable. I guess what I'm getting at here is that recognize all the different parts of the business that do impact the job you've been given responsibility to try and sort out, and working horizontally in this sort of a way to optimize those parts of the systems can be really powerful.
Yeah, I think I don't know how much of the previous talk you managed to catch. I know we were getting in and getting tech set up and so forth, but Ryan says the lessons of this talk seem to be somewhat odds with the lessons in the first talk. In the first talk, James was very much articulating the microservices approach to organizations, that small clusters of self-reliant teams are able to deliver and make a far more optimized organization, whereas you're talking about lots of increased highly network across those clusters. Do you think those two things are at odds with each other? Do you think there's a difference there, or do you think they align together?
I think maybe I didn't catch that talk, so I get the specialization and letting people focus on particular parts of a code base or services across a distributed architecture totally makes an awful lot of sense. The thing I am seeing, though, I've yet to see any organization that's quite large, of a substantial size, where you don't end up having to sort of poke outside the technical boundary, so to speak, to get work done. And I think, in particular, anyone in a highly regulated organization is going to have people who are sort of imposing policy, or that you have to collaborate with in order to optimize the larger system. If you're just talking about delivering an application, that it consists of microservices, I think it does make sense to have specialization, so long as you get those abstractions and those interfaces right. And again, maybe you're catching me on my sort of cynical view of microservices distributed systems right now, but at least most of the ones I end up working with these days tend to be not particularly optimal, and you end up increasing fragility across the system. So I think it's entirely possible for organizations to build big, complex applications that do have really clearly defined boundaries, so everyone can move at their own speed. Someone's still coordinating, though, I think, in that world once you get to a certain size. And as soon as you have coordination amongst the different functions, there's going to be processes across those that could do with optimizing. I realize that was a bit hand-wavy, but I don't see a lot of orgs at really big size do this stuff really well, because I think it's hard, and I think we're still building tooling and patterns.
And it's interesting, you talk about there being a control function or a command that needs to be at the top. And you also talk a bit about managing upwards in your talk. And can you talk a bit about the role power dynamics plays in the whole thing? How is it that those in charge or those who have power have an effect on the ability or the ease of people to be cross-functional and to engage with other departments?
Yeah, so this is something I find really interesting. I've done a whole bunch of talks about, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, talking about individual practitioners developing empathy for the executive layer, those poor, highly compensated individuals who get to exercise power over everyone. One of the things I think that's really interesting when you look at communications theory inside large organizations is that everyone spends all of this effort trying to make sure that messages from the top get cascade down really well. We have communications teams inside organizations, fine-tuning the message, broadcasting it multiple ways across the organization. It turns out whenever people actually study this stuff, that communication from top down actually already works pretty well. It gets called sort of a theory of gravity form of communication, where it flows downward really easily. And when you survey people, most people inside organizations actually have a pretty good idea of what their managers and senior managers and executives are trying to achieve at the moment. The communication in the other direction, though, is really, really poor. And I think there's a whole bunch of different reasons for this, which is that, I think you get that technical, non-technical boundary where people go, well, it's not worth communicating about these things. You're not always incentivized. You're not always in a high trust environment where, if things go wrong, it makes sense to communicate those things upwards, because, if the service goes down for 5 minutes and no one actually notices inside, do you really want to put your neck on the chopping block and tell your manager, hey, this thing went down for 5 minutes? So I think a lot of people don't work in environments where communication from the bottom up in a hierarchical organization flows particularly well. And I think that's one of the reasons I was talking about feedback loops, that I think as you start managing larger and larger organizations, I know that, when I got to a point of, at one point, I think I was managing 50 or 60 engineers, that it's really hard to work out what's going on the ground. You're not even sure. Are you getting an honest view of what's going on? Are you getting, the squeaky wheel, someone who's just upset about something at the moment, or is this a real issue? I think doing that's actually the biggest skill, I think, of managing larger organizations, of how do you get an accurate view of what's going on the ground. But I think on the flip side, I think aiming for a world where you feel you're in a high trust environment and you feel like you can accurately give the right kinds of information upwards is also worth aiming for.
Great. It's been really useful and really interesting. There's lots to tease apart here, and I think we'll be going back and trying to rewatch this and rethink about how I can apply this in the organizations that I work with. Thank you so much for your time and being involved in this. I do have one final question for you, which is, I was not a goth as a teenager, but so industrial goth, cyber goth, what kind of goth were you, and how does that work? Explain the different goth subtypes to somebody who knows nothing.
So definitely industrial goth, lots of cogs and mechanical sort of wear, watching hardware, goggles on the head, that sort of thing. And absolutely incredibly, high degree of distaste for the Victorian goths, the people, covered in black lace and velvet gloves and all of those sorts of things, top hats, those people are ridiculous.
Well, I say, as somebody who was not a goth, I looked at the whole genre being a bit like I don't understand any part of it. It was a really interesting analogy to me, because I think it does apply to the way we think of ourselves as tribes of people within technology, and very much, some of the people I work with who just view us all as technologists in a way that, makes my skin crawl, as I think you said.
Yeah, excellent.
Okay, thank you ever so much for your time. It's been really useful, and thank you for answering all of our questions.